final years gliding into retirement are exciting and invigorating and nerve-wracking too. There are many important transitions happening all at the same time, from saver to spender, from career-driven to voluntarily unemployed. Some involve hard numbers, many involve difficult feelings, and that's what today's Ask Me Anything episode is all about. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, episode 147. I'm Jesse Kramer. I'm a financial planner. I work with retirees and people getting ready for retirement from all across the USA. If you're looking for retirement planning help, you can learn more at planwithjesse.com. That's planwithjesse.com. Our review of the week is from BSLS2424, who left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and who wrote that they loved my episode on target date funds. That's episode 137, if you'd like to go listen for yourself. So thank you, BSLS2424. Please send me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog and I'll get a super soft podcast t-shirt mailed out your way. Today's episode is all about that final glide into retirement. I'll answer your questions about the important considerations in the final 12 or 24 or 36 months before you pull that retirement trigger. And as always, these questions are from listeners just like you. So please, you can send me your important financial questions for a future AMA episode. You can email them to me at jesse@bestinterest.blog, or this is a new one. I added something to my website. So you can now visit the website, bestinterest.blog, and you can submit your AMA questions to me directly there. So let's get started with question 1 today from Steven. Steven says, "Hey Jesse, I'm a DIYer, at least for now. I'm age 63. I'm 2 years from retirement. I'm most interested in the transition from accumulator to decumulator across taxable and retirement accounts." Okay, Steven, a great question to start today with. The transition from accumulator or saver to decumulator or spender, I see it as a 2-part problem, right? One part is nuts and bolts, but the big issue usually is the soft, mushy stuff going on inside our brains. There's some, serious psychological barriers to managing this transition. And the first one is tied to loss aversion and the fear of running out. So loss aversion suggests that you feel the pain of losing money more intensely than the joy of gaining money. And this principle can make spending your money feel bad, feel wrong, feel counterintuitive in some way. A UK study, for example, from the Behavioral Insights team showed how loss aversion impacts retirement decisions by making individuals overly cautious about spending their retirement savings. And ultimately, this means that people end up with a lot of their wealth, maybe even more wealth than they started retirement with by the time they die. They have more money in the bank, they have more money in their investment accounts when they die than they had at the beginning of their retirement. Is that necessarily the outcome we want? Probably not. But then another part of the problem of going from saver to spender is tied to identity and self-worth. If your identity is closely tied to your career, your job, your profession, if it's closely tied to the way you've been earning money, then retirement can trigger some sort of loss of that identity. It can trigger a loss of that ability to earn money. And if your self-worth was tied to that, well, where's your self-worth going to go when you retire? So that shift and maybe the pain or that loss that you feel can make it even harder to move into a spending mindset, where you no longer see yourself as the earner, but now you only see yourself as the spender. I'm going to borrow a line from former guest Jeremy Kyle here, who would encourage us to reframe and rename the labels. You aren't going from saver to spender. Again, you're not going from saver to spender. I don't want you to think that your financial identity is taking this 180-degree turn around, but instead, you're actually maintaining the same exact identity you've long held, which is that of a responsible planner. So that's who you are. It's not that you were a saver and now you're a spender. You've been a responsible planner all along. And as a responsible planner, your pre-retirement years are filled with a healthy savings rate and accumulating assets for retirement and all that good stuff. And then still a responsible planner, your retirement years will be filled with a reasonable and well-tested spending rate. Your behavior is consistent before and after retirement. It's the behavior of a responsible planner. That is who you are. Now, if you're still worried about the soft side of going from saver to spender, I would consult episode 143 of my podcast. In that episode, I discussed 3 major mindset issues that many retirees face. And those 3 issues are identity, relationships, and structure. And usually, if you can nail those 3 mindset issues, you will be in a much better place for retirement too. Now, going back to Stephen's original question, I mentioned some nuts and bolts of going from saving to spending. Now, from a very high level, these nuts and bolts, it's a 3-step process. Step 1 is creating a detailed cash flow analysis where you attempt to understand the money coming into and out of your life each and every year for at least, the first few years, the first decade of retirement, if not more. So common parts of this cash flow analysis would be Social Security income coming in or pension income coming into your life. Maybe if you and your spouse are retiring at different times, it's going to show that one income gets turned to zero, and then at a different time, the second income gets turned to zero. So this cash flow analysis shows the income coming into your life, but then obviously it also shows the expenses in your life, the simple lifestyle expenses, the bare necessities versus maybe the discretionary expenses. It shows your taxes as an expense. It also accounts for large one-time expenses going out of your life, because we know every year is full of some interesting one-time expenses, and retirement is no different. If you're going to plan that mega exciting trip around the world that's going to cost you, $30,000, that's probably a really big one-time expense that deserves attention in your cash flow analysis. And the difference, the gap between your income and your expenses each and every year is presumably going to be filled by portfolio withdrawals. So step 1 is creating this detailed cash flow analysis where the end result is a working knowledge of your portfolio withdrawals each and every year. Now, step 2 is creating the withdrawal framework based on those required portfolio withdrawals that we just discovered in step 1. In other words, which accounts are you going to be taking money from first? The generally accepted framework is that you pull on your taxable accounts first, your tax-deferred accounts or traditional accounts second, and then your tax-free or Roth accounts third. But there are exceptions to these rules, and I devoted a very large part of episode 121 to the nitty-gritty details of this process. So rather than rehashing it all here, if you want to know the nitty-gritty details of the optimal withdrawal framework, go back and consult episode 121. But then step 3 in our 3-step nuts and bolts process is to take your withdrawal requirements from each account each year and then ensure that you've invested the assets in those accounts properly. There are a few different schools of thoughts here, which I discuss in episode 142, another reference to an old episode, 142. One thought process is to always match the assets in each account with the withdrawal timelines of that account. The logical conclusion to that strategy is that you'll end up with a good amount of money in bonds inside your taxable account because those are the near-term monies that you're going to need to fund your early retirement years. But then there's also this concept of creating a synthetic paycheck, which again, episode 142 has a lot more details on that, which can allow you to navigate around this problem. It's slightly more complicated. It depends on how nitty-gritty you feel like getting into your personal tax planning and tax location of various assets. But again, the whole point here is that in step 3 of this process, we take the withdrawal requirements from each account, which is a certain dollar amount in a certain year from each account, and then we make sure we invest in those accounts appropriately based on those withdrawal amounts and based on the timelines. So in summary, Stephen, the transition from saver to spender has those 2 main prongs. Getting your portfolio ready for the transition is, in my opinion, surprisingly straightforward. It's arithmetic at the end of the day. It's a matter of whatever your investment philosophy is and some pretty smart financial planning rules, ensuring you give yourself enough time on your glide path to retirement to effectively make the changes in your accounts without feeling like you're kind of totally jerking the wheel off to the side. But then the mental prong of getting your brain ready for spending is a lot different. And so I'll share a quick client story with you right now. So one family I'm working with, they have about $2.5 million in their retirement portfolio, another $300,000 in cash that helps them sleep at night. Social Security is paying them about $70,000 a year. And in any typical year, they've only been withdrawing at most 2% of their $2.5 million portfolio to supplement the Social Security income. As you know, that means they are very, very secure in their retirement position. And yet, this client this year is looking to do a decent sized home project, and they wanted me to run an analysis to ensure they could afford this, roughly $35,000 project. Now, $35,000, it's about 1.4% of their portfolio, meaning instead of only withdrawing 2% this year, they might end up withdrawing 3.4%. And then they'll go back to withdrawing about 2% next year. They're still relatively early in their retirement, and I would argue they're still developing their mental muscles of being spenders. But to spend 3.5% of their portfolio instead of 2% flat that is not the kind of spending that's going to damage their retirement plan. It just isn't. I've encouraged this family to feel good and feel excited about spending this money. But I think this anecdote is a good example of the fact that feeling that excitement doesn't necessarily happen overnight. They still feel some anxiety about spending $35,000 out of $2.5 million. And part of my job is helping them overcome that anxiety. So the real takeaway here is I don't want you guys to magically think that you're just going to flip the switch to become spenders instead of savers. It takes some work, and I've seen it firsthand that it's not always as easy as people think it'll be. So thank you, Stephen, for that great question to start us off with today. And we're going to go now to question 2 from Ron. Ron says, my friend is 64, works and will work after turning 65. So the friend is going to continue working after age 65, and he'll get his current health insurance via his 61-year-old wife. My question is confusion about signing up for Medicare at age 65. I believe I've read that you have to sign up for Medicare at age 65, even if you continue to work and have health insurance. Is that correct? Then a second confusing question. I know there is only a 180-day or roughly 6-month window to acquire a Medigap policy. So how does that work if you continue to work after age 65? Well, Ron, Medicare can be quite confusing. We'll work through it today. We'll work through some of the nuts and bolts here today, and I will give you some definitions along the way to make sure you fully understand what Ron is asking. So one of Ron's main questions is this friend required to enroll in Medicare at age 65, even if he's covered through his wife's employer healthcare plan? Well, and the answer is that no, the friend doesn't need to automatically enroll in Medicare, but it really depends on one key fact. And this is where it's nuanced, it's annoying. This is the kind of thing, listeners, where I'd encourage you not to memorize it. You do not have to commit this to memory. This is the kind of thing where if it affects you, you can look it up, you can have a conversation with an expert who knows more, but these are the kind of weird, nuanced facts that I think are really hard to commit to memory, and instead you just want to make sure you get it right if and when it affects you. If this wife's employer is providing the coverage, it really matters how big the employer is. If the employer has 20 or more employees, 20 or more, then the employer healthcare plan is considered a primary plan, and Medicare can be considered the secondary plan, and the retiree qualifies for what's called a special enrollment period. The special enrollment period allows him to delay his Medicare Part B penalty-free as long as he's covered under his wife's active employment-based plan. Now, specifically, I called out Part B there. Well, I'll explain why in a second. And again, this person is going to want to make sure that he actually can be covered under his wife's plan, because his wife's plan might actually say something like, hey, if your spouse can take Medicare, then they must take Medicare. We're not going to allow them in this plan if they can take Medicare. We're going to kick them out of the plan if they can take Medicare. So you want to be careful of those kind of facts. The special enrollment period rule applies whether the coverage comes from his own job or his spouse's job. And all that matters is that the healthcare plan itself has to be tied to someone who's currently actively employed and not some sort of retiree coverage or COBRA coverage. So what is that? Okay, in summary, just to kind of clarify, if you're age 65 and either you are still working with a qualifying employer plan or your spouse is still working with a qualifying employer plan, meaning that the employer itself has 20 or more employees, then you do not need to feel like you're forced into applying for Medicare. You don't need to. Now, if the employer, though, has fewer than 20 employees, then Medicare does become the primary healthcare at age 65, regardless of the employer plan. That special enrollment period protection does not apply. And so in this case, people would need to enroll in Medicare at age 65 to avoid the late Medicare enrollment penalty. So one nuance worth flagging here, I mentioned Part B versus Part A, and the fact that in this case, again, if the employer has more than 20 or more employees, this individual doesn't need to apply for Medicare Part B. They can delay Part B. They probably don't want to delay Part A, though, because Part A of Medicare is usually free. So many people take Part A at age 65, even if they are delaying Part B. Are there exceptions to this rule? There are. One issue is that enrolling in Part A makes a person ineligible to contribute to an HSA, a health savings account, on a go-forward basis. So some people might not want to apply for even Part A, even though it's free, because it precludes them from contributing to an HSA account that otherwise they would have wanted to contribute to. Now, another thing, Ron mentioned this idea called Medigap. Medigap which is also called Medicare supplemental insurance or Medicare supplement insurance, is extra health insurance coverage that you can purchase from a private company. It's specifically designed to work alongside original Medicare, that's Parts A and Part B, and it helps cover gaps in coverage like deductibles, co-payments, co-insurance. Ron alluded to the fact that there is this 180-day window after you apply for Medicare Part B, during which you can get a Medigap policy guaranteed with no medical underwriting. So that's kind of the important part. If you don't do it in the 6-month window, then you kind of have to go through medical tests and medical underwriting to see if you qualify for that Medigap policy. So the resolution, though, to Ron's confusion is that 180-day window is triggered not by turning 65, but instead it's triggered by enrolling in Part B itself. So if Ron legitimately delays his Medicare Part B via the special enrollment period because he's covered under his wife's qualifying large employer healthcare plan, then Ron's Medigap open enrollment clock simply won't start. The clock won't start. It's a deferred clock. It's not that he's lost the clock, because whenever he eventually does enroll in Part B, whether that's because his wife retires or his wife changes jobs, or maybe Ron just decides to enroll for some other reason, when he enrolls in Medicare Part B, that's when his 6-month clock for that Medigap window begins, and no medical underwriting is needed at that point. Now, the failure mode that people can run into is when, someone signs up for Part B because maybe they misunderstood the rules in this scenario, even if they have other coverage, and that starts the Medigap clock. But if they don't buy that Medigap policy within the window, then they burn that guaranteed issue period without actually needing it yet. And they might need to go through medical underwriting if they were to pursue a Medigap policy in the future. So a couple things, Ron, for you, or I guess it's for your friend, to double check before relying on what I've said here. First, you'd want to confirm the size of your wife's employer. Again, that 20 employee line is the federal threshold that matters here. And then the other thing is that every single state has what's called a State Health Insurance Assistance Program, which it's shortened to SHIP, SHIP, State Health Insurance Assistance Program. And they provide guidance in exactly these kind of situations. They do it very specifically for retirees and Medicare. They have no products to sell. Unlike, candidly, some Medicare agents do have a product to sell. And so there's a little bit of implicit bias there. But yeah, I would encourage you, Ron, or your friend to talk to your state's SHIP program and see what they have to say. So thanks for the question about Medicare. Obviously, healthcare coverage is a major part of retirement. If you're retiring early, things like the ACA, Obamacare, or just whatever that gap to Medicare is really important to understand. When Medicare starts, it's important to understand how it all works. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I send a free weekly email to thousands of readers that shares 2 simple things, just 2. The first are my new articles and podcasts, so you'll never miss when I publish new content. And the second is my favorite financial content from other corners of the internet, so you can see what's been helping me the most.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
I hear you. I make this newsletter short, sweet, and full of essential information, and readers enjoy that. About 85% of newsletter subscribers are engaging with the newsletter more than once a month. They're enjoying it, and you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog, and you'll get a free PDF of my white paper titled The Step-by-Step Guide to Building Your Retirement Paycheck. That's right, a free weekly email that thousands of people like you are already reading, a free white paper to help you plan for retirement, and you can sign up for free at bestinterest.blog. Let's move on, though, to question 3 from Amber. Amber says, hey, Jesse, I just finished episode 115, and at the very end of that episode, you mentioned the possibility of the market being stagnant for a number of years, and how to think about our retirement plan, how our retirement plan would hold up in that situation, but also how we would hold up mentally. This isn't something I hear talked about that often on other podcasts, and I'd love the different take on what-if questions. Okay, well, yeah, thanks for the question here, Amber. Again, I think it's important that we think of 2 separate questions really here. One is, how does the plan hold up, right? How do the numbers hold up? But then the second one, which you identify, Amber, is how would we hold up mentally? So again, 2 different questions. It's easier to start thinking about the plan, the numbers, first and foremost. And I think it's important as we tackle this question, and the question really is about, what if the market crashes? What if we go through a lost decade? What if we have this stagnant long period of relatively bad investment returns right as we're starting our retirement? I think it's important that we stick to the facts, and specifically the way that we think about investment markets. We don't want to be a fear mongerer because markets have been here before. Like, bad things have happened. We don't need to make those things any worse than they otherwise were. Instead, we can use the actual kind of historical data to see how maybe our personal financial plan would fare. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's a helpful example for you. Let's ask a real life question of how would your retirement plan have held up during the lost decade of the 2000s, where we had the two bookends of the dot-com bubble at the beginning of the 2000s, and then the great financial crisis, the real estate crisis, the big short, if you will, at the end of the 2000s. So I went and grabbed some widely available market data on U.S. stock returns and international stock returns and bond returns. I built a very reasonable and basic Boglehead style 3-fund portfolio using these returns. I assumed once annual rebalancing and a once annual withdrawal just to make my life easy. I know some of you would much rather withdraw on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis, but just to make life easy here, it's as if our retiree makes one big annual withdrawal on January 1st and then lives through the next year of market returns. And then they rebalance and make another big annual withdrawal on the next January 1st, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I decided to use a 4.5% withdrawal rate here just to put a little extra stress into the situation. And the question is, how would this retiree have fared throughout this lost decade? So they could have made their annual withdrawal every single year, adjusting up for inflation. They would have suffered a little bit of pain, though, if we assume a $1 million starting portfolio. Again, $1 million at the start, and that 4.5% withdrawal rate means that in year one, we are withdrawing $45,000, and then we're adjusting up by the rate of inflation each year. At various times during this decade, they would have seen their portfolio dip well into the 700,000s. And they would end the decade with a portfolio balance of $933,000, or about 6.5% lower than where they started in 2000. Now, on the one hand, yeah, this is a relatively nerve-wracking scenario. If you've ever played around with a portfolio simulator and a retirement planning tool, you'll know that seeing your portfolio dip well below its starting point is a dangerous sign. There truly is a tipping point type of financial physics, we'll call it. There's like a tipping point here at play. Once the tipping starts, it tends to accelerate because the annual growth of a now smaller portfolio might not be able to keep up with your annual withdrawals. You know, a 20% growth rate sounds great, but if you're withdrawing $50,000 a year and you get 20% growth on a principal value of $250,000, well, 20% of $250,000, that's $50,000 of growth. So your portfolio this year, at 20% is amazing, but that growth just kept pace with your withdrawals. So the problem of having a portfolio that is decreasing too quickly in size means that any subsequent growth might not be enough to keep up with your withdrawal rate. So again, here in the first decade of this person's retirement, seeing their $1 million portfolio dip down into the $700,000 range is a little bit scary. But by the end of the decade, they're back up at $933,000. And just for fun, I ran the simulation all the way out to today. And something kind of peculiar happens in this particular case. I've done this time of exercise more times than I can count. And for what I think are very understandable mathematical reasons, you basically always see one of two things happen when you run one of these real-life retirement scenarios. Either you see that the withdrawal rate is too high and the returns are too low, and the portfolio eventually hits that tipping point that I just alluded to and ends up with a clear and unavoidable failure. Or you see that the withdrawal rate is too low and the returns are too strong, and the portfolio ends up compounding to a much bigger size than it actually started. Now, in this particular case, and I think it's just a stroke of luck more than anything else, neither of those two outcomes is actually true. So since 2010, which is at the end of the lost decade, where our retiree then had a portfolio value of $933,000, since 2010, the portfolio, this retiree, would have suffered a low point of $845,000 at the end of 2022 and a high point of $1.065 million. That's $1.06 million at the end of 2021. Most recently, at the end of 2025, their portfolio was at $944,000 in value. It's a very, very narrow range, surprisingly. So this portfolio of $1 million has supported their withdrawals for 25 years, right? They started with $1 million. They've withdrawn for 25 years. They've actually made over $1.5 million in those 25 years. And then the portfolio still stands at $944,000 today. Not too bad, a very, very narrow range on that outcome. But I decided to ask, what if instead of a 60-40 portfolio, which is what I assumed here, by the way, I don't know if I explained that yet. I think it's important that I explain that. So it was a 60-40 portfolio for this entire first test, a very basic 3-fund 60-40 portfolio. What if instead this investor had 100% stock portfolio? Now, the 2000s, we can presume, would have been much more painful for this investor. Their portfolio would have dipped a lot, and that indeed is true. There were multiple times in the 2000s where this particular portfolio would have dipped below $500,000. It would have ended the decade at about $630,000, a full 35% below where it started the decade. But since 2010, since the great financial crisis, the stock market has performed so amazingly well. And you might think that this amazing performance should make up for the underperformance suffered during the 2000s. And if that's true, then this 100% stock portfolio should be bigger in size today than our counterpoint from a minute ago, which was a 60-40 portfolio. But that is actually not the case. Our 100% stock portfolio as of today has only $386,000 in it compared to the $944,000 in the 60-40 portfolio. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. If you look at the returns themselves, year by year, compounded over 25 years, the 100% stock portfolio has a 7.2% annual return. That's nominal returns. There's no inflation adjustment there, just nominal returns of 7.2%. The 60-40 portfolio, though, only has a 6.4% annual return over the last 25 years. So that's 7.2% from the 100% stocks and 6.4% for the 60-40 portfolio. And this should beg a vitally important question for you. Now, how could it possibly be that two hypothetical retirees take the same money out of their portfolio each and every year, that one retiree has a 7% return, and the other retiree only has a 6% return, and that somehow the retiree with the better 7% returns ends up with a lower portfolio value? Now, if you're asking that question, good for you. That's the right question to be asking. And if you know the answer, even better for you. The answer is that the sequence of returns is vitally important. It's not about the average return. It's not about 7% average versus 6% average. It's about the sequence of those returns over time. An unlucky sequence of returns at the beginning of your retirement can set you off on a direction that you will never recover from. In this case, our unlucky investor, who was in 100% stocks during one of the worst stock market investing decades ever, while his head is still technically above water today, he's got $386,000 in his account today, he's in trouble. And it's purely because of the sequence of returns. So now if you want to see it for yourself, or if you've never actually seen the math behind the sequence of returns risk, I think that's probably true. I would wager that many of you have heard it described, but maybe you've never actually seen the math for yourself. So if you go to bestinterest.blog/sequence, and we'll put a link in the show notes, bestinterest.blog/sequence, I created a very simple example of sequence of returns risk in a spreadsheet, yes, but it's a very simple spreadsheet that you can see for yourself. I explain it on the website, and you can actually create a copy of the spreadsheet and play with it yourself just to see how it works. So again, bestinterest.blog/sequence. Now, back to Amber's question. How does your plan and your portfolio hold up during something like a lost decade? My answer is, if you've adequately prepared for sequence risk, your plan can hold up pretty well. Things aren't looking too bad, but if you've taken on too much risk and you haven't adequately buffered yourself against sequence risk, then such a lost decade could literally be the beginning of the end. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts and numbers side of a lost decade or some sort of extended period of negative returns. Now, what about the psychological effects of there being a lost decade? And now this is where I think the rubber really meets the road, because it's one thing for me over, a 6-minute explanation to tell you guys what it would be like to live through 10 years of a relatively bad market. But 10 years is a really, really long time. And actually living through it is going to feel a lot different than some guy chatting at you via a podcast. So said more broadly, though, the real question here is, what are some good tips for retirees during some long period of economic distress when they might be feeling like their portfolio could be or will be crumbling around them? What helps the psyche if you're living through a period that you're worried is going to be maybe that sequence of returns that permanently scars your retirement? So how do we live through this? So first things first, I think it's just important to accept that different people pass their own kind of sleep at night test in different ways. Some people are comforted when cold, hard math is on their side. but some people are only comforted by extra conservatism or extra buffer, like having a big stockpile of cash or following a 3.5% withdrawal rate just to be safe. My point here is that psychological comfort is by definition measured on a different axis than numerical optimization. And I think it's, again, just important to say one more time, psychological comfort is measured on a different axis than numerical optimization. We have to accept the fact that if you value psychological comfort, which I think you should value psychological comfort, but we have to accept the fact that if you do value it, then you might be sacrificing some numerical optimization. So what follows here in the next few minutes are some interesting ideas that I've come across that will or could help your psychological comfort. But you have to know that these ideas might also make your financial plan less numerically optimal. And the key, I think, is determining whatever that sweet spot is, whatever it looks like, some balance where you sacrifice a tiny smidge of numerical perfection in order to gain a much bigger chunk of psychological comfort. So anyway, let's go through the list. The first one, build some sort of buffer that allows you to not sell or a buffer that allows you to sleep at night. So this is probably the single biggest lever financially and mentally. If you have something like 2 or 3 years worth of essential spending held in cash or short-term bonds, something that makes it much harder to force you to sell stocks at the market bottom. That's what we want to try to get rid of. If you want to try to avoid sequence of returns risk, part of it is you don't want to necessarily have to sell that much when the market is down. So anyway, even though it's certainly financially inefficient to have too much cash or that level of cash drag on your long-term returns, the point here is not necessarily just about cold, hard numerical optimization. The next tip is to think about your income floor and your essentials. Now, what do I mean by your income floor? I think of your Social Security checks or your pension. That is the floor. That's the baseline income that you'll receive. And that floor covers some, or maybe most, or maybe even all of your non-negotiable expenses. Whatever that fact looks like, whether it's some of your expenses or all of your expenses or something in between, that should calm your emotional register at least a little bit, because it means that your portfolio swings become mostly about discretionary spending or legacy gifting rather than being about your very survival. So the reframing of, my necessities are safe or my necessary spending is mostly safe does a lot of psychological work during down markets. And again, it means that maybe you do adjust your withdrawals because maybe you just have less discretionary spending during the bad times, but you can still withdraw enough to cover your necessary spending. And speaking of flexibility, that's the next tip here, is to use some sort of flexible withdrawal rule. Sequence of returns risk is about the combination of two different factors. The first factor, of course, is just poor returns from your portfolio, but the second factor is how much you withdraw from your portfolio. If, in an extreme example, someone withdrew absolutely nothing from their portfolio during bad markets, it would totally de-risk them from sequence risk. Similarly, if you're able to decrease your withdrawals by 10 or 20 or 30% during bear markets, then you are also decreasing your exposure to sequence risk. That's a good thing. And so that's the rationale behind why a flexible withdrawal rule might make sense. By lowering your withdrawal rate during bad times, you're de-risking yourself. And by increasing your withdrawal rate during good times, yeah, technically you are actually increasing your sequence risk there, but by a very small amount because your increased withdrawals are paired with really good market performance. Sequence risk is about bad performance and high withdrawals at the same time. That's the thing you want to avoid if you can. So these flexible withdrawal rules do come with their own set of interesting logistical challenges, and I'm actually going to discuss that soon on an upcoming AMA. Not exactly sure which episode it'll be, but for now, know that flexible withdrawal rules might be that psychological relief that you're looking for during bad markets. And my last tips here are relatively short. One thing you can do is you can just remind yourself of the actual worst historical cohorts. Every bear market, every market crash feels pretty bad and feels kind of uniquely doomed in its own way when it was happening. And yeah, that's hard. And yet people came through on the other side. The next tip is to ration your logins. I've heard plenty of stories of people who check their investment accounts every day. And I'm here to tell you that nothing actually meaningful changes day to day, but your nervous system will respond as if it does. And so you'd just be better off checking monthly or quarterly or outsourcing this kind of vigilance to some sort of planner who you trust to give your nervous system a break. The next tip is a great reminder, which is to never make an irreversible decision at peak fear. As John Bogle would say, don't do something, just stand there. The danger isn't in the drawdown or the bear market itself. The danger is your response to that drawdown. So that's a good one. And then the last one, a very good reminder to decouple your sense of self from the numbers. Retirement security should be decoupled from your life in some way. I think a lot of people, especially the kind of people who choose to listen to a podcast about personal finance, right? The people like us will, maybe unintentionally, but in a real way, we will couple our finances to our sense of self. And it's important that we try to decouple that. We want some meaning and routine and social connection that isn't connected to our portfolio at all, so that we have something steady to stand on, even if the numbers are looking relatively scary. Thank you for the excellent question, Amber. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Did you know my written blog, The Best Interest, was nominated for 2022 Personal Finance Blog of the Year, and it's been highlighted in the Wall Street Journal, Yahoo Finance, and on CNBC? I love writing, especially when that writing is to share financial education, and I usually write 1 or 2 articles per week. You can read them all at bestinterest.blog. Again, the web address is bestinterest.blog. Check it out. And that brings me to today's last question from Sean. Sean says, Jesse, how do we calibrate to that question of when to retire, given the psychological bent we all have, thanks to Kahneman, Tversky, Thaler, and many others, that bent to minimize regret and not feel like we are shortchanging ourselves, our parents, or our kids and subsequent generations by truly having enough? Meaning, are we likely to just keep on working because we're unduly worried we won't have the cash flow to handle the unexpected? Sean hits on something vital here with his questions. The vital thing he hits on is that we are wired irrationally, poorly. I think that's the really big point here. I mean, it's the reason why Kahneman and Tversky and Thaler won Nobel Prizes in economics. They discovered, and their research was all about how we are not wired like calculators. We do irrational things. One of those irrational things that we do is what Sean referred to as minimizing regret. So one of Kahneman and Tversky's core insights was that people feel losses roughly twice as intensely as they feel gains. This is loss aversion. We talked about loss aversion in question number 1 today. And regret is closely related to loss aversion. It's the pain of comparing what actually happened to what could have happened had you chosen differently. Kahneman did work on similar thinking, showing that regret is actually amplified when the alternative feels very vivid or near. And the classic example here is that missing a flight by 1 minute stings way more than missing a flight by an hour. Anyway, that's just an interesting side effect, I guess. But they also found that people regret actions more than inactions in the short run. And that's very important here. Doing something where you take action and ends up going badly, that feels worse than when you failed to do something and it ends up badly. And that helps explain something called the default bias and inertia. The default bias and inertia. So the default bias says, well, and inertia says the same thing, is that we are much happier and much more likely to just continue going down the same default path than we are to change our paths. So a lot of Thaler's work focused on default bias and inertia and why anticipated regret is a big reason that people stick with defaults. So now we're kind of tying everything together. We're tying together regrets, action and inaction, and loss aversion. Anticipated regret is a big reason that people stick with their default. It's why people stay on their current course instead of making a big change. It's why near retirees might opt for that 1 more year of work instead of taking the action of retiring, which they might regret, because people regret action more than inaction. So going back to Sean's question that started us here, asking us how to calibrate to that question of when to retire, I think that calibrate is the perfect word here, Sean. Kudos to you. You chose the perfect word. It's calibrate. Calibrate means, and you might know what it means, but I decided to look it up anyway. Calibrate means to adjust, check, or standardize an instrument so it records accurately. It involves comparing a device against a known standard to identify and fix any errors or deviations. I would argue that the irrational feelings of loss aversion, of regret minimization, our default bias, our bias towards inertia, all irrational, that these are errors and deviations in the ways that humans think that we need to calibrate for. So how do we do that? I think we need to reframe the question of retirement a little bit. So if your reference point for retirement is based on your current salary and your growing portfolio, then retiring is going to feel like a loss. It's going to feel like a loss of income going from your current salary down to zero. And it's going to feel like some sort of loss in your portfolio because instead of your portfolio growing, you're now spending down that portfolio. So I think we need to shift the reference point. So instead of the reference point being my current salary and my growing portfolio, what if you shift the reference point to my remaining healthy years? You have a finite and shrinking number of remaining healthy years. And each additional year that you choose to work becomes a loss. You are spending this irreplaceable healthy year in order to buy more money that you might not ever need. Now that is an interesting way to reframe the decision to retire. And again, Kahneman, Tversky found that people regret actions more than inactions in the short term, which is exactly why retiring an action feels scarier than staying employed, which would be an inaction. But it's interesting here because the long run finding is actually the reverse. Over many decades, people overwhelmingly feel they regret the inaction, the things they didn't do, more than the actions. Meaning when you're 85 and you look backward, you're far more likely to regret working that extra year than you are to regret having lived some sort of fuller life for an extra year. The default bias is powerful here too, so let's change what the default is. Meaning, what if you choose to set a concrete retirement date and make that your default? Make the act of staying at work the thing that requires an active, justified decision. And one way you could do this is by, so you set that concrete retirement date and you tell your employer, you tell your boss, you tell your manager, you tell your spouse about your concrete retirement date, you tell your friends, you tell your advisors about your concrete retirement date. You commit to it. If you commit to that concrete retirement date, inertia now works for you. And canceling the retirement plan, that would be an action that would take a lot of effort. And further, you could decide today in writing whatever specific conditions under which you'd delay. You could say, only if my portfolio drops below X dollars, that's the only reason I'm allowed to delay my retirement. And if those conditions are not met when the date arrives, then you retire. And this would prevent, or at least hopefully would prevent, the goalposts from moving every single year, which is, I've seen for myself, a hallmark of that one more year syndrome, where the magical retirement number kind of mysteriously grows every year to match whatever you have. And then last, another tip here for you, Sean, or for anyone else feeling the way Sean feels, is to try to convert whatever abstract losses might be out there into concrete ones. Now, what do I mean by that? So loss aversion is strongest for vivid, tangible losses. And rather than just saying like, oh, well, I guess I just lost another healthy year, like what exactly does that mean? It's a little bit abstract. Well, maybe it means that you missed your granddaughter when she was 2 and turning 3. That's a very concrete year of time, a very concrete set of events that you missed out on. Maybe it means that you missed 2 fewer trips. So take out that travel list of the places you want to go and cross off 2 of those places. You're never going there because you can't get those 2 trips back, at least not while you're healthy enough to travel and hike and do all that. So that's a pretty tangible loss. Or maybe you're sitting there in your early 60s and you think about how many years you have left. The one more year that you're choosing to work, that might be 5% of your remaining life expectancy. And even worse, that could be 10% of your remaining healthy life expectancy. Now, those are some pretty vivid costs of working one more year. Kahneman's work on that vividness and availability suggests that the concrete and very imaginable loss will start to outweigh some sort of abstract financial loss. So I'm going to leave the episode right there. The glide path into retirement is very exciting and very invigorating, but also can be quite nerve-wracking, as we've heard today. And there are so many different important transitions happening all at the same time, from saver to spender, from career-driven to voluntarily unemployed, from workplace healthcare to other healthcare, and from I'll just keep saving more to will the wrong sequence of returns actually hurt me? There's a lot going on here, but I hope this episode helped. Thanks for tuning in. You can subscribe to my weekly email on the homepage at bestinterest.blog. If you love this podcast, please leave me a rating and review on the Apple Podcast app. And if you're interested in learning more about my financial planning practice, visit planwithjesse.com.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.